Walk us through the externality iceberg.
The externality iceberg. Oh, that's a great way to put it. I hadn't thought about that metaphor before. Yeah. So an iceberg, you think about sort of the top part above the sort of sea, so to speak, is what you can see, and that is a really good way to think about externalities because so much of what actually the costs of production, the societal and environmental costs, end up being sort of out of sight. So they are very much sort of below the sea part of the part of the iceberg. And I think that an important thing to think about is that beyond just it being an iceberg where you can see or can't see, actually in some ways the top part, which I would think of sort of maybe as the costs that actually companies sort of can see, actually in many ways sort of thrives on the bottom part. So the more that can be in the bottom part under the ocean, sort of unseen, in some ways the larger that the top part can be. So the profits of the company.
What does that mean? I don't fully understand that.
Sure. Sorry. You start off with an abstract question, you get an abstract answer. Apologize. So the subtitle of my book is How Business Privatizes Profit and Socializes Costs. So the idea of privatizing profit is that the owners of the company, the shareholders, can have higher profit. And in many cases, this is because of this idea of socializing cost, which is sort of akin to this sort of below the iceberg in many ways, because some externalities we can see, or even have sort of public knowledge, like carbon emissions. There's a lot of discussion around, needing to price or have markets, and that's a way to deal with the externalities. But many externalities, things like, other forms of waste, or even things like inequality in supply chains are much less visible. So if we can obscure all of those externalities, the top of the iceberg or the privatized profits can actually be bigger.
Totally, because it's an entire cost base which they don't have to pay for.
Exactly.
But return to the iceberg metaphor. Sure. On top of the horizon, what are the externalities that we can see and are priced in?
Sure. So I guess maybe I'll start with just a little bit more of a formal definition of an externality. And just put very simply, it's the costs, be they sort of impact to the environment, impact to society, of a company's production, or it doesn't have to be a company, it could be just a city or whatever, that actually do not end up falling into the profit and loss statement, so to speak. So things that are internalized are the things that actually the company is sort of paying out for. So think about, I'm not sure what it's like in Australia, but in the US, actually things like trash collection, typically there's not like an incremental charge for those. I know a lot of places in the world actually have to pay for the trash that you throw away
through one city tax or another.
So in the U.S. there is through some sort of city tax usually, but in some places actually there are trash pickup fees where if you're a business and you want to have your trash picked up, right, you have to pay a certain number of dollars or whatever for certain bags of trash. And
so it's not an individual in their household, it's rather a corporation that has tons of waste per week.
One example where I learned about this that sort of I talk about a bit in the book is a company that got started in Toronto called Green Circles. It's not Green Circle Salon. I'm not sure what the whole full name is. Apologize, Green Circles, for some folks if you listen to this. But the founder actually was getting their haircut one day and saw that actually the sort of clippings, et cetera, were sort of put out to the curb. And so, that's something I think he said told me it was like $3 a bag the company had to pay for their trash pickup. And I think presumably individuals probably had to pay for their trash pickup as well. And he realized actually if he could create a way to recycle and reuse many of the things that get used in hair salons, be it sort of excess hair, be it things like the chemicals or other sort of plastics, et cetera, that this could actually end up saving money for the hair salon, but then also ends up being better for the environment too. So this is something where, this in many instances, in many places, is an externality. If there's not actually a charge per bag for the trash, I mean, there's really no incentive to actually lower your trash unless you just want to be sort of more environmentally sustainable. But actually putting the price on that, makes people think a little bit more about being more careful.
If we just stick for as long as we can to this iceberg metaphor,
sure.
The part of the iceberg we can see, this is some expression of actually a fair market price, because their consequence to the environment, to the degradation of the public utility that they're consuming, is all priced in.
Right.
But it's everything underneath, which your book gets into, that is really the profiteering.
Yeah.
And I think you do define in the book really, really well. You say that externalities, and this is the ones we can't see, are a corporate theft of public resources.
Right.
So let's forget the externalities that are priced in now, because they make up, 1-2% of the total externalities?
Probably small, yeah.
And let's start talking about the externalities that are not priced in to the products that we actually consume.
Sure, that's great. And I want to say too, and why I really, really like the iceberg metaphor, is that, so much of the work on externalities has been done, from an economics or accounting perspective, and focuses a lot on price, on quantifying, on calculating, on ways of addressing via markets, et cetera, like carbon. And I think that is really, really important. I think that this trash example, sort of illustrates that. But I think and why I wrote the book, what frequently gets missed is that actually companies and industry associations work very, very hard to actually obscure the fact that many of the things that maybe they should be taken care of and should be part of that top part of the iceberg, end up being sort of staying below the surface. So, plastic is one that I talk a bit about in the book that I think is a good illustration of this. And, my understanding of this came about from an entrepreneur, a company called Grove Collaborative. That's the company, the founder I talked to once, and he talked about his social mission and environmental mission of the company, and even used the term externalities. He said, the key thing that we're focused on as a business is eliminating plastic, because that is the biggest externality of our business. And if you think about, that they make sort of home care, beauty care type of products, a lot of those are liquids. And for liquids, you need like a non-porous container. You can't sort of, be shipping shampoo in paper containers. I mean, that wouldn't work very well. So anyways, I had not thought about plastic per se as an externality, but then he said to me, just think about, well, first of all, using recycled versus virgin material. It's actually, more expensive to use recycled material than it is to use virgin material, just because of the properties of, of the plastic. And so that cost of choosing, virgin over plastic is in many ways an externality that's getting passed on to the public.
And virgin. Yeah. Just define virgin material.
Sure. That is just the plastic that is created anew. And, the way the plastic is created is usually through some sort of petrochemical, process that is environmentally damaging. Mm-hmm. And then I should say too, so both you have, if you do use the virgin material, that petrochemical burning process, but also you end up having the issue of plastic being recycled, because that is something that we think is happening in many cases, but unfortunately is not. I don't want to sort of disparage recycling too badly, because we should all
make a pretty big attempt at it in the book, though.
We should all be recycling, and things like glass and metals like aluminum and paper. Actually the systems do work relatively well, but plastic does not work very well.
You have a fantastic, whether it's a paragraph or a chapter, but into the 3 arrows triangle recycling and the whole PR effort behind convincing the consumer that you're you're not the bad guy here. You're buying recycled plastic. You're buying
Right.
something that can be recycled. But it's a perfect illustration of just how the company's profiteering off the hidden part of the iceberg,
Right.
and getting away with it.
And creating that hidden part of the iceberg so we don't actually realize it. So, things like the term litter bug, which has been used to sort of, help, keep,
from the plastic lobby.
that's from the packaging
Oh my
lobby. Things like individual carbon footprints are from the fossil, sort of really popularized by the fossil fuel industry. And many of these things, sort of, campaigns really are things to shift the blame, shift the responsibility from the companies onto consumers. And you see it pretty endemically. Plastic. You mentioned, but a lot of the there's been some lawsuits where a lot of internal documents from industry associations have come out, and they say very explicitly in there, let's actually put a number inside the chasing arrows, because people, if there's a number in there, people will be more likely to think that it's recyclable. But actually, aside from the number one and number two, a lot of the other plastic is not either not recyclable or really, really expensive to recycle. So most places it actually isn't happening.
And just to really hammer the point home, the reason why what you've just explained, is one of the unpriced in negative externalities, is because there is the assumption that, sure, even if I buy one-time plastic every single time, that cost has been reflected through the whole supply chain, that it's not actually going to negatively affect the environment, the labor that produced it, right, the country where the petrochemicals came from, how it was synthesized. But because of these efforts from the lobbying, and also just a total failure of accounting for the true price of the good, it becomes this huge cost on the environment and society, which in a proper fair market would have been priced in.
Right, totally. And I think, you mentioned a perfect free market, and I sort of, I wonder if that is possible to exist. The carbon pricing and markets is a good example of this, and a lot of, so obviously there's a difference between a price that is set by some authority, maybe as part of a tax situation or a market itself. But a lot of assumptions can go into these calculations. So, carbon emissions is probably the externality that has been most studied and actually most likely to, or, most commonly priced and or a market set. And in the Obama administration in the United States, there was the first U.S. attempt to actually price carbon. Okay, what is the cost to the broader society and the environment? And they came up with $42 a ton. Well, it turns out that actually when Donald Trump became president, actually changing just a very few of the assumptions, that price got lowered to just a few dollars a ton. So this idea of actually pricing the externalities is a huge challenge.
I hate to be cynical about it, but is it also insurmountable, just given the insane complexity of actually making sense of it?
Yeah, I think that's, I didn't say that explicitly in the book, but I think also one of the reasons why I wrote the book in some ways is to argue that I think that so many of the solutions where people say, oh, there's some negative externality, that's we need to just price it and make it and maybe tax the company and make it be, the government's, should be the one that takes care of this, I think is a little naive, because it actually is it is both very, very hard. I mean, the sort of different examples you went through with plastic, I think illustrated how many different areas get touched. But also this fact that companies are actually actively trying to, sort of mislead us is a strong way to put it, but sort of make us think that us as individuals should be taking care of it as opposed to them, I think is really, really important. And in many ways, the implicit sort of underlying idea behind the book is that when we think about companies' responsibility, we should be thinking about their negative effects as much as their sort of selective positive effects. So what I mean by that is so many companies really talk about their various ways they engage with stakeholders, like their great work they're doing, in their with their employees or communities. And that's important, but I think that also in some ways these sort of selective positives are ways to distract from basically the negative aspects of the supply chain.
In that case, are you placing more of the blame at the feet of the companies who willingly engage in these practices, or actually the appetite of the consumer and the politics to not be vocal enough in insisting for change?
I think everyone could do better in this situation, but I really do think the companies are where I would start, just because it's been, we see this now, a lot of stuff's coming out around the fossil fuel industry and all the misinformation around climate change. Actually, the research departments in places like Exxon and BP knew that we were going to be facing many of the issues, but actually deny. Yeah.
Cigarettes is very famously, they did that for so
Totally.
long. And I kept thinking about that example as I was going through the book, because like you just mentioned, the big oil and then big plastic,
Exactly.
and then big agriculture, and then any sort of big, super heavy consumption industry, it turns out, they are actually the first to properly understand what the consequences of their actions are. And then they kick into legal and lobbying gear.
Right.
And hope it's a few decades before the rest of the world finds out.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, in PR campaigns and everything else. I mean, it's, on the sort of how they're able to actually try to, in some ways, use PR to really shape our understanding. So we were talking about plastics earlier, and I don't think I sort of cited the figure, but it's less than 10% of the plastics that gets put into the bins actually ends up being recycled. But what do companies like Pepsi and Coke do? I mean, they have advertisements about how they're doing all this great work with recycling. And I think that is really a sort of sneaky way to continue to reinforce the fact that, you should be trusting recycling and we're helping you to do it, instead of actually trying to do like this company Grove Collaborative I mentioned is doing, and let's actually fundamentally take responsibility for this and rethink the way we do business.
It sort of goes against my small government instincts, but when you are faced with the complexity of the problem around plastic, 10% of it gets recycled, 90% of it is either burnt into the worst type of emission or dumped in the ocean. My feeling is big legislative change that just imposes this insane cost throughout the entire society, but maybe is the net good.
Yeah, I think in solutions, I think the government is hugely. I mean, really, I think the key lever. I think though that I'm not someone who necessarily just reflexively jumps to government solution. I think, I do teach at a business school, and a lot of the work I do is with companies and their sustainability and ESG. And I think that, corporate action is so important as well, because it actually can identify ways to innovate and pathways to responsibility. So, many companies might be like Pepsi and Coke, and really trying to sort of hide and avoid these responsibilities. But then companies like Grove Collaborative, we can learn from, what they did when they sort of took on this responsibility is they actually realized it was a way to innovate. And they reformulated a bunch of products, some of which have won sort of pretty major awards. So moving from a liquid shampoo to a bar shampoo is one example. They have some bar shampoo product that is, now, really, really doing well. They also took it on themselves to innovate in their internal business processes. So the managers, sort of a business lines, now have a P&L that reflects plastics. And so this provides sort of a management incentive to actually lower it. And they also do some work with consumers on sort of badging around sort of what actually, how much plastic, what type of plastic actually is in products to help consumers understand things too. So
if you really impose legal accounting measures, there'll always be chicanery, but it's definitely a step towards the right direction, because incentives just drive it all at the end of the day. And if you're not even a huge company, 1,000 employees or something, and you've got stiff competition and your staff are complaining and you've got all these problems, and you realize, okay, if I self-impose this cost on me while my competitors don't, I might go out of business.
Sure, right, yeah.
So one can also be sympathetic at the same time. But again, it's the whole question of, we have one planet, we can't A/B test it, for the net good. It probably just needs to be devastating regulation.
Right. Yeah. And I think, there is a lot of work on companies to sort of evade and get around rules. But if you can actually build it on systems that companies have sort of innovated with and come up with, it becomes a little bit more closer to reality and something that can be, that can work.
What Growth Collaborative are doing, I do also feel like, is probably the outcome that we will eventually adopt, which is that it is in fact just a business that innovates to a more cost efficient and better product at the end of the day, that just redirects all the consumer capital towards it. If you look at Spotify, they make you pay for a service, which I could do for free.
Right.
And did do for free for a very long time.
Sure.
But through the sheer convenience and discovery and all the amazing things that Spotify is, they now have, I think, 250 million paying subscribers around the world. And it's an incredible example of how an industry shifts. Now, they're software, so they have it's harder to solve that when it comes to plastic. The insane complexity of all of those supply chains now shifting to a new raw material. But even when it comes to energy production and stuff, I still feel like in our lifetimes, that will end up being what shifts our carbon emissions rather than regulation and so forth.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think there is tons of room for really thoughtful innovation. And part of it too, I think that the one of the reasons I like the Grove Collaborative story is that, sure, there was in some ways like a physical product aspect to it around, sort of around this reformulation of products, but also there is like a redefining business model aspect to it as well, around sort of their internal P&L and how they engage with consumers, which I think is a little more akin to so the Spotify example that you gave with software, where I think there's we all think that there needs to be some sort of technical silver bullet, and I think that I think we need some really amazing innovations in sustainability, but also just thoughtful changes to business models or things that don't necessarily always require a lot of upfront sort of investment.
But it'll be bloody hard. The journey Spotify had to go through, everyone else failed.
Yeah, it is very hard. Yes.
So let's shift to a few more stark industries that produce significant negative externality. I think we've done plastic, agriculture. I was surprised to see that feature here.
Yeah, I mean, this is something, and I've learned a lot about this too, and it's so interesting. And again, I'm so glad you started with that iceberg metaphor, because we don't think, in our sort of global north / more developed countries about agriculture that much. Actually, when I wrote the book, the sort of first draft of the book, and I sent it to the publisher, the editor came back and said, why is this chapter on agriculture in here? Who really cares about agriculture? Well, a couple reasons why I want to, even just for impact, I think about 25% of emissions is from agriculture, which is huge. I think also sort of a horizon issue that we're going to be dealing with, similar to carbon emissions, is going to be biodiversity and nature risk. I attended recently an event. We're in the UK recording this, but I just came back from the US where I was, and I had attended an event at the United Nations on sort of biodiversity in the coffee supply chain. And I mean, it's a real risk given climate change in particular, that actually the areas where coffee can be grown are shrinking dramatically.
They've got to go higher altitudes.
They've got to go higher altitudes, and maybe find some other locations. And this is creating a lot of risk around whether those plants can survive at given the different conditions. And so the amount that the natural world underlies our sort of daily life. I mean, coffee is an example where so many of us, myself included, are really addicted. I woke up this morning actually horribly. I'm like, why do I have a headache this morning? It's because actually with coming back from the U.S. recently, my sort of the timing of when I have caffeine is not is a little out of sync. So, but you think about the fabrics in the clothes we wear, also grown through sort of natural fibers. There's a lot of them. You think about all the things we eat, and I think because so much of agriculture has been, it's now around the world, mostly these large sort of mega farms that are in places where there's very low population. So we really don't see most people the fact that actually there's a tremendous amount of work, and also when I before I was growing up, but probably when my parents and grandparents were growing up in the U.S., a huge percentage of the population worked in agriculture, maybe 20-some%. But now, because of mechanization and having all these huge fields, I mean, it's a very, very low percentage of the workforce. So anyway, so the industry itself, I think, is really underestimated as to the impacts it's having on the world. And so, some of the externalities, I mean, there's a lot of them, sort of thinking where to start. So one just thinking about within the more developed countries, there's a huge amount of environmental damage that is done, given, there's the way that most crops are grown these days are through these sort of engineered type seeds where, they will sprout for one season, but the companies, I always say Monsanto because that name sort of sounds bad, but now they're owned by Bayer and other, sort of other ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, all these giant chemical businesses. So they don't want people to do what for centuries people had, or millennia people had been doing, where, you save a little bit of your sort of seed corn, so to speak, and that sort of, is what ends up, you can plant the next year.
Economically, that fucks the farmers. But why is that a negative externality to the environment?
Oh, sure. So it's the chemicals mostly, because they have sort of health and pollution type of impacts. Also, if you look at not just growing crops per se, but also animals, you have issues with a lot of pollution from the waste and the runoff from the animals. And it's interesting to think about the way, again, sort of, if you think about just how actually farming and agriculture and animal husbandry were done for millennium, you had this wonderful sort of natural cycle of, you had small farms, things were grown, they may have had some cows, pigs, chickens, etc. The manure from those cows, pigs, chicken would sort of be put on the farm to sort of help enliven the soil and bring things back. And what we've done is instead of having this great natural cycle between sort of animals and crops, we've specialized and totally divided those industries, and we just have these gigantic sort of cornfields and soybean fields, and then we have these gigantic, sort of pig, I don't even know, they're not called farms. I don't know.
Sties.
Yeah, the sties are, big, gigantic pig sties. And as a result, there's not that, sort of reciprocity or natural cycle, and then we just have tremendous amounts of waste, and that waste is really a big part of the externalities.
And from the book, you speak specifically about the negative externality from downstream of monoculture.
Yes.
I was in Mexico a few years ago visiting a friend who ran a cafe there, and he took me up in the mountains behind Veracruz to where he got his coffee from, which was, barely profitable, living by the skin of their teeth, group of about 20 different small farmers who handpicked the coffee, but then also grew it in a pretty dense forested area. So it was a true opposite of monoculture, whatever that's called. What is that called?
I don't know. Diversiculture.
Yeah, okay.
It's my make of a word.
But it was an incredible experience because next to them was a entire hillside of Nestle.
Oh, okay.
And we walked up to the border of it, and you could see the difference in the soil color, the striations throughout the soil of where the water could just run completely down versus these small fincas on the other side, which were rich and moist and green. And the other was organized as such because you can take a machine through there efficiently.
Right.
And therefore it all comes back to the bottom line. Whereas these guys, are all in their 50s and 60s and still hand picking on the side of a hill high up in the mountain.
Right.
But it was just an incredible example. And so after that long-winded anecdote, I would ask you to explain what are the negative externalities of monoculture and how can we reprice them into the final product that we're having?
Yeah, good. Well, an issue with always sort of thinking about externalities is that it really depends on it's very idiosyncratic to the specific application that one would be talking about. So one issue with monoculture is, I think, pretty nicely expressed by your little anecdote in Veracruz. You have issues of resilience and biodiversity in the, sort of in the whatever the opposite of monoculture is example. And this is something, and this is why, in many ways, again, sort of I think that it's so important to think about externalities beyond just the bottom line pricing, but about a more sort of holistic idea of actually resilience for the future. Mm-hmm. So, you think about if we have everything like the Nestle example, if there's some disease that comes, that actually targets that particular whatever strain it is, that's totally gone. Whereas, if it's actually in a much more diverse type of setting, that won't have that disease effect. The famous example, that gets talked about a lot. Coffee is one because there is limited genetic variety from what I understand, but also bananas. There's this Cavendish banana, which is whatever, it's like, I've been hearing a lot, okay, if there's like one sort of parasite or something that actually targets these Cavendish bananas, we're fucked with bananas. Exactly. So in many ways it's about, creating greater resilience. And I think that,
There is a very sympathetic view to this as well, though. Living in Stockholm, I can walk to my grocery store and literally buy anything.
Yeah.
The effectiveness and the total feat of humanity that is big agriculture all around the world. We can buy a lot of stuff. There's more food than we'll ever need, and we're 8 billion people.
Yeah.
So, it's not all bad news. These negative externalities that haven't been priced in for so long have also allowed for where we've gotten to. So are you always straddling this line?
Yeah, totally. I'm not, I'm someone who, So many people might, I teach at a business school. A lot of the work that I do with companies is around their sustainability. And there is certainly a segment of folks that think like, oh, well, really that's actually just enabling the sort of long, destruction, but just maybe extending it out over a longer period of time. And I'm not someone who necessarily, I think that actually that sort of markets and how we've developed economically, the innovations that have happened have been hugely important for living a good life. But to your example about being able to get sort of everything sort of that's out of season transported to you in Stockholm, there's a lot of environmental issues with that as well. And so that's another thing that's really not seen. We go to the market and, it's, some sort of maybe blueberries from Mexico. And it's crazy to think, maybe you have blueberries in Mexico, for very, very probably, €3 a tin. It's amazing to think that is possible. But that's actually because, I'm not sure about Mexico, but in the U.S., a lot of agriculture also is a lot of this sort of monoculture agriculture is subsidized by the U.S. federal government because of the sort of lobbying and power of these large agrochemical companies, and then because it's cheap, they can sort of send it all over the world, and it's like a double whammy sort of.
One more point on the monoculture,
Sure.
Because you just mentioned soil biodiversity. There was a very famous documentary a while ago called Tipping Point, and one of the episodes was on soil biodiversity, and it's very alarming if what they're saying is truly the case. And on this same Mexico example, as we were driving up, we drove past acres and acres and acres of avocado trees. And he was explaining to me that these are they demand so much of the soil that after a couple of years of growing them, the soil just grows nothing for a decade. This is, if we're going to take the negative externality seriously, that long-termism on the soil biodiversity somehow needs to be priced into that thing that has grown there on that day.
Yeah.
But then you return to the impossibility of the accounting of it.
Yeah. And I think too, I'm not someone who, I think a lot of attention in the sustainability space has been a little unfairly put on consumers. Consumers, are the one, consumers want this. I think a big reason why there's all that avocado being grown in Mexico is because U.S. consumers now love guacamole and having
It's the best.
an avocado toast. Actually, strangely enough, the event I attended at the UN on the coffee actually had avocado toast as this little snack that they gave people. So I do think that consumers, if we can get a better understanding of some of these impacts and trying to eat sort of in season and more local, and sort of understand that, actually having everything at the corner shop is convenient for us, but actually has a lot of costs for other people.
But again and again, it has been proven that the consumer will purchase according to their means, and rightly so. Fair enough.
Sure.
But unfortunately, you look at chocolate, for instance. No one is living in some fantasy world where they realize that slavery is not in the chocolate bar. I still eat chocolate. I've interviewed guys who have explicitly researched this, and there's a guilt there, but also it's just like a hardcore reality. We sort of, we consume via our means, not via our morals.
Yeah, sure. I think I think that's well put. I don't think that actually people. I think people like us that are sort of broadly in this space understand about all the abuses in the chocolate supply chain. But I'm surprised when I actually, because that's an example that I give in the book, and Tony's Chocolonely, and they've done a lot of work to try to quantify and try to price in some of the externalities. And when I tell people about the fact, like this sort of origin story of Tony's and how the sort of founder actually realized that there was slavery in the supply chain, and this led to the, to the founding. People are aghast. I mean, it's just the general public. So I think there could be more education on that. But again, I'm like you. It's so distant and so far from our experience in more developed type of countries. Actually, what that means, I think, is hard for people to conceptualize. So, yeah.
Okay. You mentioned you don't want to put too much blame at the feet of the consumers, and we've both just agreed that people will consume according to their wallets. Right. But clothing is potentially the worst, especially when you factor in the labor negative externality. Nowhere is more rife with slavery, human trafficking,
right,
and so forth. But fast fashion has never been stronger.
Yeah.
And people are consuming, 20, 30 different types of clothing per year.
It's amazing.
It's nuts.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I was growing up, people had very limited number of, I saw some statistics. So I grew up in the 1970s in the US, and nowadays it's like 10x the amount of clothing that people have. And I have kids that are teenagers, and they're sort of
shopping.
They're TikTok and Shein, the sort of the fast fashion company Shein, and they know and understand. I try to sort of talk to them and educate them, but it doesn't do much good, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so many ways that fashion, and I think this, is part of the complexity, because part of it is the materials. Some of these are made through synthetic, sort of plastic, basically, type materials. Even the more natural materials like cotton are usually, they're actually, the growing conditions for the people that are working in those supply chains are not great, to put it mildly. And you mentioned as well just the sort of manufacturing, is another sort of case where, there's just tons of human rights and labor abuses. I mean, there's a reason, why these clothes are so cheap. I mean, it's really unfortunate. I shouldn't laugh.
What work has been done to try do an accounting of the negative externalities for, say, H&M?
Yeah, good question. I don't. There must be some companies that look at this in detail, but this really requires a company to say, okay, we're gonna go deep in our supply chain and understand and account for, in an end-to-end way, what actually our impacts are. One company, it's not H&M, but it's a smaller company, but Allbirds, which is a shoe and apparel company based in the U.S. They've been very, very thoughtful, particularly around carbon, in how they actually can create a system in their through their production, through the entire value chain, really, from way upstream to the materials, all the way down to actually consumer impact. If you think about the externalities actually shaping consumers and consumer purchases, like this fast fashion, is one way to actually try to put a brake on some of these environmental effects that are coming. Is actually, if we can change consumption patterns, if we can actually create secondhand marketplaces, which some companies are doing, create repair, so much, fashion. I shouldn't even call it fashion. So much apparel just gets sort of thrown away because there's a rip or something. If we, back when I was growing up, sort of darned socks and you repaired things. Nowadays, I'm guilty of this. If I ever get a hole in my sock, I throw it away. I'm not.
Who's repairing a sock?
Exactly. Yeah. So Allbirds is an example, and they took a real end-to-end approach, which is what I really like. So they started with their materials. So a big material for them is wool. So they work directly in New Zealand with some farms that grew sheep and actually sort of understood how they could create systems where, it was sort of like the old days where there was a more regenerative system where it wasn't just a bunch of sheep in a pen, but actually, grazing in much more natural conditions and sort of this symbiotic fashion with the land. One of the reasons why I focus on accountability within companies as a very important lever for sort of understanding and change is that when you actually try to measure and account for and report on some of these environmental and societal impacts, it actually creates learning that you can actually become a better company. And the Growth Collaborative example is one of that. But what Allbirds did when they realized that actually the majority of the negative environmental externalities in their product was in the sole. So if you think about, the athletic shoes that we wear, typically, the sole, it's made of plastic, basically. And they actually worked to create a new material made mostly out of sugarcane, which in the way that it gets sort of farmed actually, creates positive externalities. So actually is, sort of sucks carbon from the air. And one of the things and one of the reasons why I like this example is that, what they realized is that, if they really want to affect the natural environment with their work and be a leader in this, they shouldn't just make it their proprietary IP where they say, okay, we've got this special sole. The consumers, may or may not appreciate, but actually they open sourced this technology and actually have worked with a lot of other leading shoe brands to actually introduce it into their products. So there are 100 companies, Adidas being the most sort of well known. There's actually now a shoe that's co-branded, Allbirds and Adidas, that uses this material and is, I think, the lowest carbon shoe around.
To force some type of economies of scale for access to that sugar cane.
Exactly. Thank you for connecting the dots there. Yeah. So it's one of these things that, if they just keep it as their proprietary material, it will always be expensive because the volume will be low. But if it's something where they open it up,
So it's a phenomenal example, and a cynical or skeptical person might say that Adidas getting on board is a measure of ESG, but is the sugarcane sole better than a polyester sole?
Performance-wise?
Performance-wise, durability-wise, cost-wise.
So I think probably the very short answer to all those is no.
Okay. That's such a shame because you want to hear yes.
However, I think that, so I've been tracking Allbirds for a while, and I had talked to them actually when they were in the process of, sort of working on this material and before it actually was in production, and then watched, actually they originally just one of their shoe lines sort of featured this, and it was actually a little crappy looking to be honest, not to use a not good term to describe it, and it was more expensive. But these are things that I think economies of scale and working with these brands will help fix. So I think that clearly the cost curve is working in a way that actually, it's at some point it hopefully will be cost parity, and also by working with these leading brands like Adidas and others, the performance in other aspects also will be improved. So I think this is something where it's the trajectory is it's not there 100% yet, but it's actually improving.
So it's good ESG from Adidas in this case.
Well, I think that it's good ESG. So if by that you mean they're just doing it from some social responsibility motivation.
A genuine effort rather than a greenwashing effort.
Yeah, so it's definitely a genuine effort. And I also think that it's something where, we're not all sort of running, 2.5 hour marathons or 2 hour marathons. Actually, we don't need the top performance gear. I think that, so they see this as, there is a market segment, and it's not even just the sustainability market segment per se, but that a lot of the market segments that they're dealing with, actually, this is a very, even in the current state where it's actually, they haven't fully met the quality and performance, it's still a really effective and material, maybe and probably as good as what they would be using normally.
What are the most egregious examples of greenwashing that you've come across?
Oh, geez. This is, there is so much greenwash. And I should also mention, and people probably know this, is the idea of, just saying you're doing good environmental things and communicating, putting sort of a green veneer on things that actually are not happening within the company.
Like an oil company saying they're going net zero.
Like an oil company saying they're going net zero. Exactly. That's a very good one. I mean, I think the examples we gave around the packaging industry, saying that they're sort of, recycling is one example. There's been a lot of cases recently that have been in the news because the EU and Canada actually have both introduced recently anti-greenwashing legislation where companies can be sued for greenwashing.
Right on.
Yeah, so some of the examples that have sort of hit the news in the airline industry, a number also sort of claiming net zero, but actually, or claiming sustainability, but actually, it's the airline industry, it's unfortunately, because actually air travel, at times is very essential for us to sort of communicate and do our work, is very environmentally damaging from the fuel that is used. So airlines have been called out quite a bit. One company that I just recently read something about is Keurig Dr. Pepper. Do you know Keurig? They make these coffee pod coffee capsules. So they, I guess, had been saying they were recyclable, but actually were not, and they got fined, millions of dollars and paid the fines. That's another example.
Yeah, rightly so. Two companies that I was very surprised to see feature as examples of companies that have huge negative externalities was Netflix and Zoom. So could you explain why they?
Yeah, this is another
negative externality?
And again, it sort of is our the iceberg that we that you started us off with. So the and this has come even more to the fore since I wrote the book with AI. There is tremendous environmental issues on water, on energy use of the cloud, so to speak. So, think about sort of Netflix and Zoom. These are really about, sort of bits and bytes sort of transporting back and forth in the ether. And that there's, the servers and technology infrastructure that needed to support that. There's huge environmental, costs for it. There was a really good article recently, I think it was in the Washington Post, that actually quantified in very sort of evocative ways how much carbon and water gets used from something like ChatGPT. And what they said is actually having ChatGPT answer like one query is the equivalent of taking a regular sized bottle of water and dumping it on the ground. So it uses that much. And think about, there's millions and millions of these being used. Carbon emissions also very, very huge. And it's interesting that, Microsoft, who is a company, I am usually pretty skeptical, but maybe at some point too naive. But I actually have a pretty positive view of how Microsoft has been approaching this. They're the only company, I think, certainly within my knowledge, but I think that of any company that is actually committed to being net zero historically. So they, founded in 1975, I think, and have calculated the carbon emissions that they have expended, in its history, and said we are going to, in some way sort of offset or actually, I'm not exactly, I mean, I assume it must be some sort of offset technology, all of our past emissions. And this is something, as we're recording this, the UN COP meetings are going on in Baku, Azerbaijan. And this is a huge issue in our situation, environmental situation. The fact that countries like the UK, like the US, we have industrialized and have had tremendous carbon emissions over time. And carbon emissions are cumulative, so it's not like, it's like year to year. So our, the worlds we live in are totally based on us being able to have all the, have burned all this carbon. But no one ever talks about accounting for the past, whereas Microsoft, actually says, okay, we should actually be accounting for our past carbon emissions. So anyway, sort of long sort of digression, apologize. But Microsoft recently said that actually their carbon emissions, because they're very involved in AI, obviously, they're a big investor in OpenAI, they increased by 300%. And you see a lot, 300% over the last few years because of AI and because of the incredible technical infrastructure that is needed for that, like the chips. NVIDIA, this company that produces these AI chips. Apparently, those are hugely energy hungry. In these server farms, there's like tens of thousands of these chips, and it's interesting because a lot of I don't know if it's a lot, but a lot of press gets covered around companies like Google or Microsoft or Amazon, these huge, server farm installations they have. A lot of them have solar power. And you think, well, that's maybe they should be net zero, but actually the amount of carbon emissions that get expended in making the sort of physical things that are in there is actually way greater than actually the carbon emissions to run it. So it's
But in all of that, where is the negative externality? Because I thought it was all priced in here. These huge data centers are incredibly energy intensive, but they're built next to solar power. There's a giant one Google's building right now just outside of Oslo. Hydropower is going to take care of it.
Nuclear, they're all investing in nuclear.
And it's very expensive. Yeah. So is it the case that these negative externalities are not being priced in here?
I think...
Because that has to be the claim.
Yeah,
otherwise it's all good, right?
So I don't know if anyone's calculated specifically the negative externality, although this, Microsoft increasing its carbon emissions by 300% does, that could be calculated.
The cost has also increased massively. These things are super expensive.
Yeah, but I'm not, they're definitely expensive. And you look at these, they talk about sort of how expensive the chips are, NVIDIA chips. But again, this is my assumption. And I'm based on sort of understanding a lot of other contexts. My guess is there's still a lot of environmental externalities on the table. And because so much of it is, if you think about, what it takes to produce the machines that actually are and that's where actually nowadays, I think, because a lot of them are, solar powered and, I'm not sure where your listeners are from, but a big deal in the United States. And I was born in the state of Pennsylvania and lived there, and my parents still live there. And
Scranton?
No, that's Joe Biden, which is from the east part of the state. I'm in the west part of the state, which
and Michael Scott.
Pittsburgh, which is where sort of the steel industry used to be headquartered, and sort of in the middle of Pittsburgh and Scranton area is where the 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor set of nuclear reactors is, which had a big in the 1970s. Big failure actually, and is now sort of shut down. And Microsoft is paying, I think, $2 billion to actually restart that nuclear reactor in order to get, and there's a number of other examples of this, of where tech companies are working directly with, sort of legacy nuclear reactors to try to get sort of more power onto the grid. But that only supports the actual power to run those. If you think about, cars that we have, the big environmental impact of cars is actually building the car and sort of the engine and the transmission and the
raw parts from all over the world.
Exactly. It could be an electric car, which is great, or all the battery.
Although building an electric car is significantly more damaging to the environment than a regular car.
Exactly.
That environmental payoff doesn't happen for decades.
Right.
But the reason why I was pushing back on where is actually the negative externality in these data centers is because also as a part of the accounting has to be what the opportunity cost is. What is the trade-off here? And so with Zoom, it is every meeting I take on Zoom is a meeting that I didn't have to get into a car for or get into a plane for. And so this is why I wanted to ask you, particularly with Zoom, is it really the case that despite their insane data usage, these data centers are obviously incredibly steel intensive, plastic intensive, energy intensive, but it doesn't have the same perniciousness as something like single-use plastic, clothing, runoff from monoculture and so forth. So where really is the negative externality?
I think that's a good point, that actually and it does sort of illustrate the challenges of accounting, because, and I think a big issue that I'm a big fan of is actually finding better ways to account for avoided emissions. So, you think about, again, to come back to the Growth Collaborative example, by making sort of a shampoo out of a bar, make it in a bar, they're avoiding a lot of environmental impacts that they would actually have if they put it in plastic and had water and had shipping and et cetera. So I think the Zoom example is a good one where, it is very much like an opportunity cost of avoided emissions by potentially having travel. And probably there might be incrementally more meetings, as a result, or maybe more people will dial into the meetings. Or, it would take a complicated, equation, but it's definitely doable. That said, I'm not sure where sort of when you grew up. I don't want to age
the 90s.
You. Okay, I don't want to age you necessarily. But when I was first working, actually, I grew up in the 70s and I was working in the 90s in financial services. And at the time, obviously computers have been around for a while, but really we're starting and the internet was getting going. The technical infrastructure of business was coming into its own very much. And there was so much discussion of paperless offices and how this was going to save us, so much paper, people saw environment as sort of very or the paper is a big environmental impact. And we've, find actually, no, it is not necessarily saved paper. Actually, I might print things more because just the volume of my,
Surely not printing more now. You've got maybe, a computer and email and Google Drive.
Yes, I think actually now maybe. Although I do still, I print some things. I have a variety of books. The volume of what we do is so much greater that actually, because of all this, there's this phenomena called the Jevons Paradox that I talk a little bit about in the book. It's also known as rebound effects. And this is where, as sort of things get technically more efficient, actually because of just the sheer volume increasing, there actually ends up being larger environmental effects. And so this was why it's called Jevons Paradox. Is there was in the 1800s an economist named, I think it's like Sir William Jevons or something like that. He was from the UK, and he observed it was the early steam engines that people were talking about how there was a lot of smoke in the early days, but the smoke was going to start dissipating because engines were getting more efficient. And he said, well, no, actually, I bet you that the smoke is going to increase more and more, because as things get more efficient, actually the use will get much, much greater. And, it might be, and this has been shown, like LED lighting apparently as well. It's supposed to be it's a lot more efficient. However, people end up using it a lot more, and actually ends up creating more environmental effects. So when you think about Zoom, I think you're right. There might be these sort of avoided emissions. However, because people are meeting more and more, sort of actually meeting is a better than just calling someone up, because you can sort of see them and you can engage. Maybe more people are joining these Zooms. Maybe something having to do with the fact they're getting together more makes them want to sort of get together in person more. So there are all these sort of second order effects, which again sort of make it a challenge to calculate.
Just further doubles down on the impossible complexity of trying to make sense of it.
Right.
Because then as well, you throw into it the phenomenon of less from more. How much raw materials are saved because we all carry an iPhone?
Right.
Millions of tons, right? But then is the iPhone better for the environment after we take into account all of the other infrastructure we're talking about? It just becomes so impossible. Okay, but we're really running up on time. So I'm just going to ask, we have already touched on it, but I want to explicitly point it to you this way. How much of these inefficiencies, the failure to price in the externalities, environmental damage, discrimination of all sorts, and all the rest, how much of it is actually just unavoidable and iterative speed bumps, which get solved gradually along the way to broader prosperity? Because in the last 10, 20 years, over 100,000 people a day are lifted out of poverty, and the developing world is industrializing at a fraction of the environmental cost that our country's developed in. So a global marketplace has also allowed for, if maybe not more fulfilling, but at least millions and millions of more working opportunities to people who otherwise would never have had it.
Good question. And I think in theory things should work that way. But it's sort of like someone that I draw on a bit in this book is Thomas Piketty. Where he sort of showed about how actually as wealth grows, there's not necessarily a trickle-down effect. I think a lot of times, actually in the U.S., this gets brought out. Ronald Reagan was the sort of famous person that advocated this. Also, I think in the U.K. here, Thatcher, as well. That sort of a rising tide lifts all boats, and that the more and more, you maybe cut taxes for rich people. There will be greater entrepreneurship, greater economic development, and then there will be this, sort of global, sort of growth. What Piketty shows, however, is that the sort of richer the rich get, the bigger the higher the walls around themselves get built, and this actually creates greater and greater economic inequality over time. And clearly, a lot of people have been risen out of poverty, although the majority of those are in China, which is a separate case, which we can discuss. But I think that, one of the things I try to focus on in the book is around the ideas of, how companies are really being very active in trying to hide and protect their ability to the profiteering. And so while I think that there's a case to be made for what you said, my inclination is that because of just how, in some ways, power operates and wealth operates, there's an inclination to not let that sort of spill out and over to the broader societies, but actually to try to protect it. And by protecting it, it actually leads to these externalities and leads to the sort of greater inequality as well.
Yeah, that's a terrific answer. That does really actually make sense. And that comes through heavily in the book too. It's not trying to save the world and get every single negative externality accounted for, but rather that particularly pernicious chicanery of profiteering is solvable.
Totally. Yeah. Or at least, I mean, I think the more and more we're aware of it, the more and more we can identify and try to mitigate it. And actually then, hopefully some of these processes that you describe will be, more prevalent.
Last question regarding the Profiteers, and then a question I ask every guest.
Okay.
You riff on Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I think in the opening chapter.
Sure.
And the theme there is that it's not actually the answer that matters, it's the right question.
Yeah.
So having lived in this world, done so much research around it, what should be the questions that we're asking?
Yeah. So one of the reasons I put that in there is because, so a whole other topic, which I don't talk about in the book, but I think about a lot, is the role of business schools and socialization of business leaders on these topics, and how they're thinking about it. And so much of the sort of discourse and thinking is around like doing well by doing good, like how can we sort of align like our, being more sustainable with profitability. That is really the core sort of question that's being asked. And I think that as general public, consumers, citizens, that's actually how we think about things too. We look at what are the good things that companies are doing. That's the question. So, what good is the company doing? I think that the question should be what bad is the company doing, actually. And because that you can get to really understand whether they are like as responsible as they say they are. A company like Grove Collaborative, they're having negative externalities, no doubt. But their mission and thoughtfulness is on trying to avoid those externalities and mitigate them and create systems to actually, help resolve them. Whereas a company, like Pepsi or Coke, they're doing all these sort of side things, I think, to distract attention from the fact that, their products are leading to this global obesity epidemic. They're like the biggest plastic wasters in the world. So, if they were really like thoughtful in the way that Grove Collaborative was, those would be the issues they'd be dealing with. They wouldn't be distracting us with these various, regenerative agriculture. Pepsi has this thing called Pepsi Positive, which is maybe the specific things they're doing in that are good in some ways, but really it's a more sophisticated greenwashing operation where they're distracting from the pernicious effects of their business model.
It's a terrific way to immediately cut to the core. How good is the business?
Right.
Because if you ask them what bad are they doing, and just a little bit of bad, that broadly they're quite good.
Yeah.
But to the point of Coke and Pepsi,
right?
I mean, what good do they do?
Right.
Apart from philanthropic efforts as a measure of ESG.
Totally.
It's sugar water that's addictive and makes people obese.
Yeah. And the amazing thing, I mean, not to sort of pile on this, but there are well-known like assessments of companies, responsible companies that have companies like Pepsi or Amazon or Facebook, and we didn't talk a ton about sort of the online issues, but all of the sort of misinformation that like I'm talking about Facebook now that has occurred.
Oh my God. That's a whole nother rabbit
totally
hole.
Whole other rabbit hole. But so these sort of rating systems of companies' responsibility, they end up just looking at these selective positive things without really assessing the underlying business model and effects of that business model. And that's where I think that we need to be, having scrutiny and putting attention on companies.
That would be for a professor in business, that would be such an incredible study to do. what are the cultural externalities of social media?
Yeah. That's something.
Is it doable? That'd be phenomenal and so necessary. Jonathan Haidt did it a little bit in his most recent book. Finally, Christopher, rather. Apologies.
Chris is good. Yeah.
What is the role that serendipity has played in your life?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that serendipity's played a huge role in my life. And in this great job that I love at Cambridge University, and if you look at the path that took me here, it's all been through sort of little sort of accidents, one way or the other. One thing that sort of stands out, I actually ended up going to work. The first job I had was at a financial services company, actually in the call center, and just happened through a couple chance being in elevators with leaders or having my desk located where leaders are, got to know people that ended up really shaping my career as an example. Again and again, I can look back and think, I thought I wanted to get a PhD, and the University of Michigan was relatively close to where I was, working at this bank. And so I went, so I just sort of drove. I said, okay, I drove to here. And that ended up also, taking my life on some very different trajectory. So a lot. Serendipity is under recognized as a force in the world.
I love that, mate. Thank you so much. And it's a perfect response. And having asked that about 150, 180 times, it's uncanny.
Yeah.
It really is. The audience will roll their eyes because I say it all the time, but there's a quote from Soren Kierkegaard that life can be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards.
That's a good one.
Which just encapsulates that. Yeah. But absolutely loved the book. There's a guy called Adam Lantz who wrote to me and said, you have to interview this guy if you want to talk about externalities. So thank you to Adam, and thank you so much to you for being generous with your time and bringing me to Cambridge.
Great. Well, happy to. Great to talk. Really enjoyed it, Ryan.